Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyeva cha Patitanam Pavnebhyo Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namaha. Hare Krishna. I'd like to welcome all the viewers to yet another interesting discussion on this very important topic of reading Srila Prabhupada's books every day and its contribution to our individual spiritual life and how it strengthens ISKCON as a movement. For today's discussion, I'm inviting one of our very, very senior members in the society, a GBC member. He has many firsts to his name. First, let me give the name, which is His Grace Praghosa Prabhu. Praghosa Prabhu, welcome for this discussion. Praghosa Prabhu has many firsts to his name. The one that I remember is probably he was the first Irish person to join the movement. That was a joke. The second is he definitely was the youngest second generation or first generation, whichever way you may look at it, Prabhupada's disciple to become a governing body commissioner of ISKCON. Besides that, he also has another badge of honor, which is he managed to, over a period of time, push out anti-ISKCON propaganda with something very healthy, very positive, in the form of Dandavats. So Prabhu is the person behind Dandavats, and we all owe a lot to Dandavats for what it has contributed to our keeping us happy and excited every day in our lives. So many other things. The one other thing that I really like is conversing with Prabhu, hearing from him, especially when he gets on the stage. He has this knack of bringing in apt, appropriate quotations of Srila Prabhupada to remind everyone. And that was indeed the main reason why I invited him for this discussion. Praghosa Prabhu, I'm sure you would forgive me for where I would have transgressed etiquette, but thank you so much for joining us today.
But what I won't forgive you for is, embarrassing me with those comments.
Well, there'll be more coming, so please tighten your belt. Praghosa Prabhu, what was your first experience with Srila Prabhupada's books? When, where, how?
Oh, okay. Nice question. My very first experience with Srila Prabhupada's books was that I, believe it or not, found, and subsequently actually I've understood from other devotees that this type of thing is not uncommon, but I actually found a science of self-realization on a bus. And the cover of the Science of Self-Realization in those days, was a picture of Srila Prabhupada. And, I guess, how old was I? I suppose I was around 18, 19, that kind of age. And, I don't think I'd ever really seen, or I certainly hadn't registered with me before, seeing a person like that. Now, of course, we would use the word, sadhu and like that. But at that point in my life, I just, it's interesting, you could never really now think like that. But, a certain point in your life, you don't equate pictures, images you just haven't seen. And, and you just don't, you can't place them, basically. Because my next experience, which actually is arguably more significant, having said that, the Science of Self-Realization became a very significant book in my life, actually, in many respects. But the next thing was, I was at, quote unquote, and my apologies in advance, I was at a party in a person's house. That person is a devotee now. Not sure if I should mention them, but they're a devotee now and have been a devotee for many, many years. But at that point, they, like me, had recently been introduced to Krishna consciousness. And of course, as in the great tradition of book distribution, that person, I think they told me they'd only, met devotees a week or 2 weeks or something like that. And they hadn't joined the temple or anything. They were still living in their flat, their apartment. And they told me that somehow or another, next, they agreed to buying a full set of Srila Prabhupada's books. So that was all. Great book distributors, devotees really pushing out. We saw with the Badger campaign just now how successful devotees have been. So this person. I was in their apartment, as I say, at a party. That they hadn't made any commitment to Krishna consciousness at this stage. I knew nothing about that. And late into the night, when sort of you're just sort of spacing out this, that, and the other, I noticed a box beside me. I was sitting on the floor. I noticed a box beside me. I looked in the box, and what I didn't know at the time, but what now I know, it was a box of Chaitanya Charitamritas. And I saw a picture again. I didn't know at the time. A picture of Lord Chaitanya, and I just couldn't. I remember looking at it, thinking, "What's that? Who is that? A person? Is that what? Is that an artist impression of something? I just couldn't place it, and because for me at least, because I couldn't place something, it just really intrigued me. So likewise with the Science of Self-Realization, it really intrigued me. So when I was getting off the bus, I brought that book home with me.
Which one happened first, the bus experience or the party experience?
Actually, memories can be a little challenging sometimes. But now that because as I was speaking about finding the book, then I remembered the party experience with the Chaitanya Charitamrita. And I think if you were to push me on it, I think I would say the very first experience was actually the Chaitanya Charitamrita at that party. I, of course, at that point didn't read any of that book. I was just looking fascinated by the pictures.
Well, Prabhupada said that these pictures are windows to the spiritual world. It definitely seems it happened to give you a glimpse and got you interested in coming back and picking up on this literature. When did you actually, which year, and when did you actually pick up a book and started to read it? And what inspired you to do so?
Well, okay. That I do remember a little bit better. And it was the Science of Self-Realization, the one that I found on the bus. I think the year that I started to read it was 1981. And the reason, very clear to me, the reason, because it's pulling me right back to my early days. It's quite interesting. Oh, and I'm revealing everything, and it's online, and it goes out online, etc., etc. But anyway, what to do, what happened was I had that book, I guess, for at least a year, maybe more, something like that. But again, I hadn't bothered to pick it up and read it. And what happened? It was in my apartment, my flat. And then what happened was I had a girlfriend at that time who will remain nameless, and basically she broke my heart. I mean, that's the phrase that we use in English. She broke my heart, meaning she went off with another guy. Quite a crushing thing, actually, for a young adolescent, that you have a girl and then they go with somebody else. It's like, wow, what a smash to the ego kind of thing, So that really hit me bad. First time it ever happened to me. And thankfully the last time. I have been married for 36 years now. Yeah, that was crushing. That was a really crushing thing. And somehow or another, while I was wallowing in my, moroseness, one evening, somehow or another, I looked and I saw that that was on a kind of a bookshelfy type thing I had. I just noticed that book again, and something inspired me to pick it up and start reading it. And that was when I started reading the Science of Self-Realization. And of course, now I know, reading in Bhagavad Gita, there are 4 types of people that come to Krishna consciousness, and one of those is the distressed. So I was in a very distressed situation. She had put me in I thank her. I fall at her feet now. But she had put me in a very distressed situation, and then I started reading the Science of Self-Realization. Yeah.
Do you remember anything from your first reading which really struck your heart and made you say, oh, I want to read this more or read it again?
Absolutely. This is very interesting, because absolutely. And I've spoken about this, at different times. I can't remember now. I'd have to really go and check, and I didn't check beforehand. But because in one sense it's relatively innocuous. It wasn't like some big thing that Prabhupada was saying, because he says it millions of times in his books. But for me, whatever part of the book I was reading, there was just a sentence with a comma in between, as far as I can remember. Maybe it was 2 sentences, but I think a comma in between. And it just basically said, Prabhupada was saying, we are not these bodies. And then the very next phrase was, and we are not these minds. And when I heard that, when I read that, that literally, right at that moment, sort of lifted that distress. That distress literally melted away, because I could understand that this distress that I was experiencing was very much as a result of what was going on in my mind and the attachment, etc. and all. But two things: the attachment to the girl, but then also the kind of ego being crushed by, you know, her opting for somebody else. So when I read those two sentences, or that one sentence, whatever it was, it just completely explained everything to me, and everything fell into place. And it was actually really, really powerful. And actually, that's why, I guess that's also why the verse in the 6th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Udared Atmanatmanam Atmanam Uvashadayet, that when Krishna's explaining that our mind can be our greatest friend and it can be our worst enemy. And it's our greatest friend when we are in control of it, and it's our worst enemy when we're not in control of it. That's always been a really inspirational verse for me as well, as a result of that early experience in taking to Krishna consciousness.
Prabhu, it seems like just Prabhupada's words had such an impact that you really didn't have to go, you know, and take any kind of help anywhere else. And it also seems that you were alone by yourself and no devotees or nobody else, and just with just the words of Prabhupada.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, having said that, of course, you know, I should then add that what happened subsequently. I was living in London at that time, and then I think very shortly after that, I connected with the devotees in Soho Street, because that seemed like a logical next step, you know, having read. But yes, your point is very valid. That was exclusively on the Shakti of Srila Prabhupada's words, and his words in written form. Because of course now we have so many videos and so many audios, etc., and all of that, and they're wonderful too. But at that point in time, that wasn't available to me, and probably wasn't even so readily available for many really in those days. So it literally was the power of Prabhupada's words in the written form. Absolutely.
Prabhu, I know that you read a lot, and I'm sure that even in your young age, you must have read a lot. When you juxtapose what you read, those words of Prabhupada, versus everything else you had read before, any comparison, anything that you can present to inspire us?
Well, sorry, if I understand the question correctly, you're saying that something I might have read that wasn't necessarily Krishna conscious as such.
Absolutely. That's the comparison I want to see.
You know, Tapan Prabhu, I don't know if this is the answer you want, but I think I would have to say no. I think I would have to say no. It was just incomparable, actually. I don't think at that stage, late teens, whatever it was, I don't think that I don't think I'd ever even thought what the mind was. I mean, maybe that sounds like a fairly dramatic statement, I guess, you know, but it's certainly not in any, maybe I'd skimmed it slightly or whatever, but certainly in no depth, no, and making that distinction between the body, the mind, the intelligence, the soul. Yeah, no, I don't think I would have. I think what I read in Prabhupada's Science of Self-Realization was completely unique to me at that time.
I mean, the book Science of Self-Realization, with the many devotees that have spoken, it's led such an impact on the lives of so many devotees, you know, who just moved, especially those, quote unquote, who I would call as were looking for intelligent answers, were coming from other faiths, and they could see in that book how Prabhupada clearly separated pure Krishna consciousness, real spirituality, with what was otherwise quoted or claimed to be religion, spirituality, etc.
Yeah, I guess
what was your experience in that regard? I mean, you come from Ireland, and we all know Ireland used to be, and it still is a fairly strong Shaktiman country. So please feel free if you want to answer that question. I don't want to put you in a spot, but it would be helpful to hear.
Yeah, Ireland is known as the land of the saints and the scholars. Yeah. But yeah, I wouldn't have done so much kind of reading of the. I mean, the one person that did actually really intrigue me actually in my youth was a person called George Bernard Shaw, who he was born around the 1820s, 1830s, and he actually lived to a really ripe old age, I think 93, something like that. And I was a little interested in him, certainly. What really fascinated me about him was that he was a vegetarian. And of course, at that time, I had just become a vegetarian. This was prior to meeting the devotees. I'd become a vegetarian, again, being inspired through other people, actually. But then he became really fascinating, because at that time, in Ireland at least, being a vegetarian, what it meant, well, I was living, that was just before I went to London. So I was living at home with my parents and or with my family. And basically, meal times when you were a vegetarian in those days was you got the exact same meal as your family, minus the meat. Like that. So, and there were no vegetarian restaurants. There was, in Dublin, there was one, what they call it, macrobiotic restaurant, but it wasn't exclusively vegetarian. So really, vegetarianism really hadn't taken hold whatsoever, at least in Ireland at that time. And, then I started thinking, God, amazing. Imagine being a vegetarian in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s. How austere that must have been, trying to keep to your vegetarian diet. But then this is kind of, I think, some people may know this, but it's kind of a humorous thing. And again, it sort of attracted me to George Bernard Shaw, was that he one time, very late on actually, when he was in his late 80s, maybe even touching 90, because as well as being a writer, he was also a kind of social mover as well, in the sense that he wasn't a politician as such, but he sat in what's called the Seanad, which I don't know, people would know the British system better maybe, which would be the equivalent of the House of Lords in Ireland, yes, kind of thing. And he sat in that. So he was going to some function one time, and some lady who hadn't seen him for a long time, many years, she approached him at that function, party, I guess, sophisticated party. She approached him and she said, "Oh, George, you're looking wonderful for your age." And he immediately responded and said, "It is not I that is looking wonderful for my age. It is you who is looking terrible for your age. And the reason you're looking terrible is because you have spent your life feasting on the carcasses of dead animals." And I just remember thinking, wow, that's really. And then I started reading more of his quotes on vegetarianism. He was asked one time, "Why are you a vegetarian?" He says, "Because animals are some of my best friends. And unlike you, I don't like to eat my friends." And he was very forthright. He was actually, in that sense, of course, Prabhupada told us we shouldn't exclusively, focus on preaching about vegetarianism, although he did actually sanction preaching about closing of abattoirs. That was something he did sanction. But anyway, but still, this person is in the 1800s, so what would he have known? But you could see he had a real preaching spirit, So I guess to answer your question in a long-winded way, he probably was the person that I would have got inspiration from prior to reading that in Srila Prabhupada's books. But I have to stress very strongly, what I read in Srila Prabhupada's Science of Self-Realization was just literally earth-shattering, earth-moving. It completely changed my life.
Like it has changed many, many lives, Prabhu. It was now 40 years ago when you came across Science of Self-Realization. Do you still read Prabhupada's books with the same enthusiasm, despite the fact that you may have a very busy life now? So what is your reading habits now?
That's a very interesting question, actually. It's a very good question, because we do know that whatever inspires you initially in any aspect of your life, it's hard to recreate that, because it's so earth-shattering, so foundational, so different, so it is actually hard to recreate that. And I would say that there was a period, if I'm honest, I would say that there was a period in my Krishna consciousness, fairly early on, really, to be honest, maybe after maybe 5 years of being a devotee, something like that I went through a period where I kind of, I'm not sure that I consciously thought like this, but reflecting on it, I think there was some of that there, that I kind of knew it all. Now I have the picture. Now I know, yeah, okay. And somehow or another, my attraction and my inspiration and my fondness for reading Srila Prabhupada's books definitely waned. But then it came back. and came back with abundance and with real.
How did that happen?
Well, I think the main reason that would have happened would have been. It's interesting. I don't know how we've got onto this, but this is actually a really interesting discussion because and please understand that my answers here are very, very spontaneous. You know, this is you know what I mean. I hadn't pre-thought any of this, and it's just because of your questions, your probing questions, that I'm kind of thinking like this. But I think it kind of relates, actually, in my case at least, and maybe others can relate to it. In my case, definitely, it would be connected to the tendency for being overzealous and fanatical in your early years in Krishna consciousness and thinking you know everything, you know, everyone else is wrong, there's nothing else that anyone can offer, you know, a real militant view, if you like, of Krishna consciousness and overzealous, over fanatical. But that wears off eventually. That always wears off. And when it wore off, I started to experience more vulnerabilities in my own self and my understanding of the world. And then coupled with that, as you get, particularly now, if we take now as an example, I'm spinning way forward, of course. But if you look at how, you know, we know padam padam yadvi padam, that there's danger at every step in the material world. But sometimes if you're cosseted in a country that is in essence fairly secure and fairly okay economically, and you've got a stable family life and all of that, it's harder to really fully realize the danger at every step principle. But now, of course, in the last recent times, and I don't know how much we want to get into this type of thing, but just to mention, you know, the political instability in the world. I've never known in my life, I'm 59 years of age now, I've never known, I guess that I started taking an interest when I was 13, 14, whatever. I remember my father used to always watch a program on a Monday night called Panorama. And I, of course, when I was a young boy, I had no interest in that. I used to be freaked out by the music of it. The music was very, very, you know, sinister almost, you know. But ever since I did start taking an interest, I have never known a time in the last 40 or more years, 50 years, 45 years, I've never known a more unstable time in terms of, say, climate change, in terms of obviously the pandemic that's just hit us, because it's the first pandemic that I've ever known of in my life. And then even political things around the world, you know, I shouldn't really mention this, but, you know, for most people, at least in Europe, what's going on in America is just inconceivable, what's going on with their political system. So I guess as a result of losing that hardcore fanaticism, recognizing more your vulnerability, and then the material world itself adding into that vulnerability, I think that gave me renewed inspiration in relation to reading Srila Prabhupada's books. And Srila Prabhupada, of course, is fantastic. He literally has commentary on anything you can conceive of. I'm sure many devotees have been searching the database with the word pandemic or epidemic, etc., and seeing Prabhupada's different thoughts on that subject. So Prabhupada has thoughts on literally everything, which is wonderful. And yeah, I that rekindled my reading, I would say.
And how much do you read these days?
Well, you know, we understand from Srila Prabhupada that his kind of minimum requirement was an hour a day. So from that point of view, that's certainly what I strive to do. And generally,
you could say that again. You are a GBC member, a senior member. We'd like to hear that, because rarely do we get to hear that statement. Mostly people are talking about chant your rounds, follow your four regulative principles. But at least in my experience and traveling around, meeting with devotees, you'll be surprised, Prabhu, that doesn't come up that often. Even if you attend a Bhagavatam class, which everybody should, but rarely do you hear speakers saying, hey, listen, after you leave the class, go and study for an hour. So we want to hear it again. I mean, when did you first hear it? Was this the culture when you joined the movement?
Yes.
What was the culture like in the 80s when you joined the movement?
Oh, that statement was a really, really well-known statement. Absolutely. I would say when I first joined the movement, I would say that was the fifth regulative principle. Really, really was. You know, and it was a culture that we should endeavor to read for an hour a day. I'm not saying that everyone did it or everyone did it all the time, but definitely it was a very well-known reference from Srila Prabhupada, and it was definitely something that devotees did try to do. And just because you mentioned about doing it after class, that is something that I never do, just as a point of information. But my experience of reading, as I think most devotees would know, it can be the greatest sleeping pill, you know, and a great cure for insomnia. You just pick up a book and start reading. So for me, what I endeavor to do is in the morning time, which, by the way, you're interrupting now. Just joking. But I will try to clear as much as possible of the in tray, you know, because the in tray is there and you have to respond to this and deal with this, you know, your to-do list. So I try to attack that as fast and as intensely as possible after breakfast, right up to lunchtime. And then after lunch, I will take a nap. And then when I wake up is when I do my hours reading, or endeavor to do my hours reading. Because there's two things about that. Well, one thing mainly is that you just had a nap. So I find myself most refreshed, and it's very unlikely that I'm going to start falling asleep again. So that would be my reading kind of schedule. Straight after lunch, have a nap. And then once I wake up from the nap, I will then read. And then the other thing, of course, is that you don't always achieve it for one reason or another. That's absolutely true. But then it also gets supplemented with other reading that I would say is more service-based. In other words, you might have to research something, or you're sent something that you have to read, and there are many references to Prabhupada and Prabhupada's quotes in what you have to read. So, you know, there's your kind of hour that you try to get of your own personal reading, and then there's the supplementary reading that just comes as a matter of course.
Very encouraging, Prabhu, to know that you're able to give an hour and still follow the fifth regulative principle. I wish that the fifth regulative principle was enshrined more formally so that all of us feel inspired to do the same. Prabhu, I want to ask you two questions on this point. One is, what is your observation regarding the culture of reading in the movement over the last 40 years now? Improved, the same? What's happened? So please share something on that.
Yeah, and you know, I don't want to be controversial.
Please go ahead. I can edit it out if you tell me later.
Well, I would say, like I said, for me joining, it was kind of the unspoken fifth regulative principle. But the problem nowadays, in my experience, I'm not saying this is all over the world, but certainly in parts of the world that I'm familiar with, I would say that one of the big problems is, I don't want to be black and white, and I don't want to say that it has to be like this, and I know there will be exceptions, but still you asked me the question, so what can I do, you know, except express my genuine kind of opinion on it. You know, I'm not just it's not just you know, a sort of anyway, it's something that I definitely this is something I have thought about a lot. Previously I said you're extracting from me things that I hadn't really thought about, but this is something I've thought about. I think the problem is that as time goes forward, more and more devotees, and all glories to them, and it's not a direct criticism of anybody, you know, individually, but more and more devotees do not go through ashrams. And we are essentially a congregationally based movement. And I think that as a congregationally based movement, it is much harder, one, for ISKCON to be able to assert the importance of these things in the minds of people. And two, just being a devotee living out in the outside world with all the usually they're mostly, you know, family people, etc. It becomes more challenging just time-wise and all of those things for them to actually dedicate time to reading. Whereas if you're living in an ashram, I mean, it was also sometimes tough living in an ashram as well, by the way, because there was always so much service. I thought it was tougher
the way devotees served.
Yes, yes.
In some places.
Yes, although my experience is, for instance, going out in Sankirtan, etc., that most party leaders that I would have ever served with, you know, they would have set aside reading time every day, you know. So, you know, in one sense tougher because, yeah, life in an ashram can be quite intense with so much to do. but still, because you're with devotees who understand the importance of reading, there was a focus on that. Whereas I just think that intense focus may not be there so much in the congregation as such. And I tell you, just because you've asked the question, for me, one of the biggest problems with this, of course, how can I say anything's more important than reading Srimad Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita and Chaitanya Charitamrita, etc. You can't really make that statement. But at the same time, one of the big problems I find is that many devotees, who don't go through an ashram, somehow or another, the reading of Prabhupada's conversations and his letters and that type of reading material, that I don't think that gets nearly as much attention as is needed. In fact, I would have asked, quite a few devotees just in an ad hoc way, no scientific basis for this in one sense, but just different times, just get to ask different people. And some devotees would tell me they've never read any of Prabhupada's letters or his conversations. Any reading time they do get, they read Bhagavad Gita or Srimad Bhagavatam. And I think the problem with that is that devotees aren't getting a clear understanding of ISKCON, why Prabhupada created ISKCON, why it was so important, the history connected to the Gaudiya Math. Actually, I should do a shout out here for Bhakti Trumarj, our wonderful, wonderful Bhakti Trumarj, who obviously recently left us a few months ago. He really did emphasize this as much as he possibly could. And it's so important because otherwise, devotees become quite detached from the institution and they don't really see its importance, and some devotees even almost start to see it as an impediment. Oh, it's just bureaucracy. Oh, it's, organized religion, etc. You get all these kind of references. So somehow or another, it's not just, instilling the concept of reading back into our movement, that sounds too broad brushed, but reinvigorating it into our movement and bringing it up to a higher level. It's not just reading per se, it's also what we read, and it can't just be philosophy. It also has to be the history of our movement and how it came about, etc.
Fairly, quite a few things you said there, Prabhu, in the past few minutes. Mm-hmm. But to me, it seems that it's important to set the context of what this movement is, where it is supposed to be, without creating that context that comes through Prabhupada's letters, his conversations. May be difficult, may not be impossible, but may be difficult to, tie the threads and find out the context of the movement. But here is another important question that I want to ask you. We hear very often words such as Srila Prabhupada as a founder Acharya, Srila Prabhupada as a preeminent Siksha Guru, instructing spiritual master, etc. How could any of this ever come to fruition? Literally speaking, how could it come to fruition if devotees were to not get the context through reading what Srila Prabhupada has left in form of his purports, in form of letters, etc. And so what's the solution? We have become what we are, which is a congregation-based movement, or many devotees are living outside, working outside. So what are you thinking as a solution to overcome this?
A few years ago, I was at Bhaktivedanta Manor for Janmashtami, and the Bhaktivedanta players put on, I guess it was the 50th anniversary, was it? Yeah, I guess it was the 50th anniversary. Anyway, they put on a drama, and the drama was about Prabhupada establishing ISKCON. And of course, we did see quite a lot of that during the 50th anniversary. My thing would be, and I think it would be really wonderful, actually, I've done this a few times. That I'm going to digress slightly and quickly come back to your question. I've done this a few times, not recently, by the way, but I have done it when I was a younger devotee. Again, this was something that started in the UK during Prabhupada's time, but what was called impromptu dramas on the street. And it just has such an amazing effect, If you're just on the street and you're with a few other devotees, of course, but you're dressed in civilian clothes, and suddenly you just start performing a drama. And it takes people, I did this at the GBC meetings a few years ago. It was a very funny experience. Full GBC meeting room, plenary, and there was also the deputies were there, I think, as well. And myself and Prabhu Prabhu, we had set it up beforehand that I'm trying to remember why we had the floor. We had the floor for some presentation. I can't remember exactly what it was actually now, the presentation. But anyway, I started with this impromptu kind of drama, which no one, and it was really funny to watch. You look at, and particularly Bir Krishna Maharaj, you can ask him about it. Because, oh no, not Bir Krishna Maharaj, sorry, he's the one that said he sussed it early that it was. But you can practically ask any of the GBC member, you know, they all thought this was for real and they were getting really, really worried, you know. But anyway, whatever it was, Braj Bihari offered that mediation would be a good solution. And I just started blasting him. Mediation's rubbish, you know, it's just a kicking it down the road solution, never deals with anything. You know, I started really getting on his case, you know, and he started to go really sort of like, you know, sheepish and fearful like this, you know, and the GBC, and one GBC member, I can't remember who it was, looked to the chairman and says, Mr. Chairman, you have to put a stop to this. Is outrageous what's going on in our... But anyway, the reason I relay that is because impromptu drama has a really amazing impact, you know, that you just suddenly start doing something that people aren't expecting, have no idea about, you know, and it really captures their attention. That's the point that I'm making. So I don't know about impromptu or how you would do it exactly, but I definitely have thought about the idea that Prabhupada's life in ISKCON, not just how he started it, but even start beforehand with the Gaudiya Math, going to Prabhupada, come to America, how he started ISKCON, and then right through all of Prabhupada's manifest pastimes up till 1977, take all the really key ones, the, you know, the really instructive ones, etc., which will be difficult because they all are, but anyway. And somehow or another, you have a traveling roadshow that goes around the whole ISKCON world and puts on festivals where these pastimes are enacted, and you bring to life Prabhupada's letters and Prabhupada's conversations, etc. You just bring them to life. So rather than someone sitting down and having to read it black and white in a book, they literally can go and have a cinema or theater experience of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very interesting idea. In fact, one thing that I always thought was, how could we really appreciate, I mean, it's a catch-22 situation. How could you really appreciate what's written in the book without appreciating who the author is, and vice versa? You know, so this whole notion of Srila Prabhupada as a preeminent Siksha Guru, Srila Prabhupada as the founder Acharya, can only really be fulfilled if you do what you're saying in one form, but have a relationship with the author of these books. And that's when you want to pick it up. Some of us had this experience in the 90s that it was the Leelamrita, which gave us that impetus. You know, it really gave a shot in the arm, that a red color jacket, big one. It used to be a big book, you know, thick book in those times, but we just picked it up. And after that, our commitment to the movement, our desire to actually wanting to do something just went up tenfold. So I really appreciate that point.
Actually, just on that point, Kapan Prabhu, now you're reminding me of something else.
Yes, please.
My very first experience of seeing Srila Prabhupada in terms of a moving picture, because previously it was just pictures in books in Science of Self-Realization, was when I went to the Sunday feast at Bhaktivedanta Manor before I became a devotee. And prior to the Sunday feast, the lecture, etc., they showed your ever well-wisher in the theatre room at the Manor. I don't know if you know the theatre room at the Manor, but they showed the video, Your Ever Well-Wisher. And when I went into the theatre, it was sort of half full or whatever. And I really appreciate this in hindsight. I went up to the back. I didn't go to the front or the middle. I went to the back of the theatre, so I was in the back row. And I really appreciated it because it brought me to tears. So here was a 21-year-old or whatever it was, 21 something. Here's a man, macho, but full of false ego or whatever, man. And suddenly I'm watching this video and I'm feeling tears coming to my eyes. And that's why I was glad I was at the back, because I didn't want anyone to see me crying. But the power of actually these stories, what Prabhupada sacrificed, like you're talking about, and you read it in the Leelamrita, and then you see it on these videos, it has such a powerful effect.
And they are transcendental because they don't have many fancy gimmicks in it like you'll see these days in cinema and theaters. It's just simple truth, told with eloquence, as they say. And it was amazing. I mean, I recall and being moved. Prabhu, now, I want to ask you one more question. What impact in your personal spiritual life has reading Prabhupada's books had over the last 40 years?
Well, I don't know if I have anything particularly profound to say in one sense. And sometimes when you're asked those questions, your mind immediately starts thinking, oh gosh, I should have something really profound and incredible to say here. But I kind of would be, my honest answer would be that probably the biggest impact that reading Srila Prabhupada's books, regularly reading Srila Prabhupada's books is that it just prevents me from falling into illusion. Or let me put that a different way. It won't let me fall fully into illusion.
Say that again, please. I lost you in between.
Sorry. The reading of Srila Prabhupada's books, one of the biggest impacts it's had on my life is that it will not now allow me to fall fully into illusion, to fall fully back into Maya. So in other words, no matter how much sometimes I'm struggling, with Krishna consciousness, with whatever, there's no question that, and I know it's like an intellectual reality for me. I can never forget this. It's impossible. Prabhupada's teachings are that they've made an indelible mark on my mind, my intelligence, etc. I can never, ever, no matter how hard I try, I can never, ever forget the teachings of Srila Prabhupada. And therefore, there is no point in me trying, and no point in me trying to, give up Krishna consciousness, etc. No matter how difficult it becomes, it is just completely pointless because I will not be able to do so. So for me, as I say, that may not be a particularly profound thing, but it's just a really powerful thing. I remember hearing a story, again, it's a UK-based story years ago, about one devotee who bloop, basically left the movement. And we don't use that word anymore, by the way, either. But anyway, we did in those days, and he had blooped. He left the movement. And he was in a pub one evening, sitting in a pub, having a pint of beer or whatever it was, or maybe something stronger, I don't know. Anyway, he was sitting in a pub and on his own. And then somehow or other, he got chatting with somebody. And the person that he was chatting to started telling him that they felt suicidal. And he encouraged them, and was successful in his encouragement, for them to go and visit a Hare Krishna temple. And the person did. They went and visited a Hare Krishna temple, and that person is a devotee, and is a devotee to this very day. So for me, when I heard that story, I thought to myself, it's amazing. It's amazing, you can leave Krishna consciousness, you can quote unquote bloop, and you can dive into the material pool and into Maya, but you can't forget the teachings of Prabhupada. And therefore, even though this person, this devotee, is sitting in a public house, a liquor house, drinking alcohol, he then starts preaching to somebody else, and then that person becomes a devotee, So yeah, reading Prabhupada's books, it smashes the illusion. You cannot absorb the illusion again. You cannot accept the illusion. You just can't. It's impossible. At least for me, it's just impossible.
Very moving, Prabhu. Very moving. Prabhu, what do you say? What do you say to devotees, who are now overwhelmed with the number of books that are out there to read, and they're struggling? How do we fit all of this Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, Chaitanya Charitamrita, and worse still? I mean, I don't know if you've heard of this. I heard of it from someone of the speakers who said that actually sometimes devotees are now told that you should not read Srila Prabhupada's books till you've read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You need to have the qualification, and as in not me, thank God, but somebody else is going to tell them when they're ready to read Srila Prabhupada's books.
I find that
Where did that come from? I mean, what's this?
I don't know. I find that what you just said, I find that very depressing. I've actually never heard that. That basically some people are saying that you have to read, you're talking about books by other devotees, I guess, is it? They have to read
Yes, books by other devotees, and them saying, or others who I may call quote unquote fanatic followers, saying you've got to read this before you can even access Srila Prabhupada's writings, so on and so forth.
I must say, I really would not want to be, whoever's giving that information, whoever's giving that instruction, I really wouldn't want to be in their shoes at the time that I leave my body. My God, how offensive is that? It's just outrageous, absolutely outrageous. So how can they say it, one, and two, how can anybody accept it? I mean, it's ridiculous. Like I said, I found the Science of Self-Realization on a bus. I found the box of Chaitanya Charitamritas at a party I was at. Prabhupada translated all these books and printed them and distributed them to the general public on the street. The Christmas Marathon started in to my understanding, because I think there were maybe one or two different variations, but the basic story, this Christmas Marathon, or the Prabhupada Marathon as we call it now, started in Los Angeles in 1972. And what did they distribute more than anything else? The Krishna book. The Krishna book is talking on one level about this personality lifting up a mountain with his little finger of his left hand. In another pastime, you're talking about him stealing the clothes of the gopis. Yeah. Prabhupada was having his devotees distribute that book on the streets of Los Angeles and all over the world, of course. Where does that come from? How can they say that? How can they justify that? And two, how can anyone take it seriously? Of course, you have to have a little sympathy for the second category, because maybe, they're new and they've never, they don't know anything, but as soon as they start, again, if they read Prabhupada's letters and conversations and
they wouldn't be here. They wouldn't be here, yeah.
They would then turn around to that person and say, that's absolutely rubbish. I'm not following that instruction. That's a bogus instruction. And actually, you'll see behind me, I've got Yogeshwar Prabhu Swami in a Strange Land, Bhakti True Marge's Mercy book, Ocean of Mercy book. And I'll have different books, obviously, like that. But for me, they very much come into the category of, ancillary reading, extra reading, additional reading, supplementary reading. They are never my focus of prime reading. Never. Always Srila Prabhupada's books. And in my humble opinion, that should be the case for all devotees in ISKCON. And something else I would say, the BBT should be, in my opinion, extremely careful about what books they accept for publication and printing under their name. Because the BBT is the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, it's Srila Prabhupada's Book Trust. I'm not saying that you have an absolute ban on the BBT publishing other books, but they have to be extremely cautious about what other books they publish in the name of the BBT.
Right, but then there are so many other venues from which devotees are publishing books, but that's a good start. You're right. I mean, that's one place where one can exercise caution. Prabhu, I also want to ask you that often leaders, managers in ISKCON centers, temples, they're overwhelmed, much service, so much to be done, what to prioritize. What would your message be with respect to keeping Srila Prabhupada's books in the center, ensuring that the members within the temple and then the larger congregations, what can they do and what should be their priority? How can they keep everybody engaged? Any suggestions that you may have?
But specifically engaged in reading Srila Prabhupada's books, is that the question?
That's right, yes, that's right.
And we're all different here, by the way. We're all different, so there's not one size that fits all, that's for sure. But certainly reading groups are a good idea for many. Many people do find it difficult to read alone and read on their own. Other people really thrive on that, so you can't say one or the other. But certainly reading groups, and of course now in the present environment, online reading groups, which are very easy to organize, very, very easy to organize. You mentioned the Lilamrita. We have that going on at the Dublin Centre at the minute. That there's an hour a day of online of the reading of the Lilamrita. So reading groups is certainly one thing. Again, though, this just really is applicable to temples. But I know a lot of temples that I'm connected to or know about. That they would dedicate time for reading Srila Prabhupada's books in the actual temple in a collective sense, or a collective environment. So, something like that. Again, I go back to the thing about reenacting them in some sort of dramatic way, so as that it captures people's attention. And of course, you know, I guess you can't get much more than the leaders of our movement. So we're talking temple presidents, we're talking GBCs, and of course we're talking ISKCON gurus, you know, very important. Now, the point you make earlier about other books available, I mean, a lot of them other books do come from ISKCON gurus, I guess, or quite a few ISKCON gurus. So they may have have to some degree a conflict of interest. I don't know. But certainly all the leaders, including the gurus, should really, really be promoting Srila Prabhupada's books. I mean, from my own personal perspective, I can't get over this simple point. And because I can't get over it, and because I've got a big false ego, I can't see how other people can get over it either. But what I can't get over is, and I say it so many times when I'm speaking or giving talks or whatever, that none of us would be here unless it was for Srila Prabhupada. You wouldn't be writing this book. You know, you just wouldn't be writing your book about this, that, or the other, whatever it is, you know, if it wasn't for Srila Prabhupada. Everything that we do in Krishna consciousness is 100% as a result of the mercy and compassion of Srila Prabhupada. So we constantly have to be, the leaders particularly, have to be refocusing people's attention on that point, and that everything stems from Prabhupada. Now, of course, Prabhupada will say, everything stemmed from his spiritual master, the previous charyas, etc. And that's absolutely true. But for us, everything, the starting point for everything is Srila Prabhupada. And, you know, we talk about gratitude. There is nobody, we will never be able to fulfill the debt of gratitude to Srila Prabhupada, no matter what we do in this lifetime. But we can at least try. And one of the key ways that we can try now is by promoting Srila Prabhupada's books more and more and more, both in terms of their distribution, but also in terms of devotees taking time to read and study them, which of course was Srila Prabhupada's own instruction.
Yes.
He said, you cannot be going out distributing these books and then someone asks you a question and you're stumped. You haven't a clue what the answer is. You know, you also have to read the books. You can't just distribute them. So, you know, this is Prabhupada himself. He said, you know, I read, you know, Prabhupada, as you know, reads his own books. And when he's reading his own purports, his realization is, I didn't write this. It's impossible that I could have, that you know, Abhay Charan Day, it's impossible that I could have written this. This is the super soul writing this. And that's why Prabhupada was indicating that it's as important for him to read his own books as it is for anybody else, because actually they're coming from Krishna, you know. So there just has to be, and by the way, Tapan Prabhu, let me say, all glories to the service you're performing right now with this Shravanam effort. And I know you're part of a team, but still, you know, what you're doing here is exactly what's needed, actually. You know, more and more devotees putting this kind of emphasis and this priority on Srila Prabhupada and the reading of Srila Prabhupada's books. So actually, in one sense, when you ask me that question, you know, what you're doing is part of the solution. And I just think that has to grow and expand, and more people to do that.
Well, I take that as a very encouraging statement, but we're also now entering the realm of where I'm going to start getting embarrassed. But Prabhu, I'm thoroughly moved by what you just said, very moved. And I'm sure that everybody who heard you speak with that emotion coming straight from your heart would be equally, if not more, moved in ensuring that we owe, in Prabhupada's terminology, cent% everything that we have to Srila Prabhupada and his writings. Srila Prabhupada does live forever through his books, and we'll only be able to appreciate it if we pick it up and read it every day.
Absolutely.
I am very thankful. The only reason that we have to bring it to a closure is because we strive in coming close to the hour. But Prabhu, I am hopeful that we can continue this conversation yet another time, because I somehow had this feeling that there was more for us to explore. So please be kind to us, and maybe not immediately, but in due course, because the whole purpose of setting up this ISKCON Shravanam week is, like I said, it's not an alternative to the Srimad Bhagavatam. It's not like we're not going to read outside of this week, but it's just a reminder, shot in the arm, that leaders and everybody else must give their life and time to read Prabhupada's books, for which Srila Prabhupada gave the best time of his day and most of his life. On that note, I thank you once again for your time today. and look forward to speaking to you again, Prabhu. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure, a real inspiration, and it's been a really good morning that I've had having this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you. All glories to Srila Prabhupada and all glories to Srila Prabhupada's transcendental books. Hare Krishna.
Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Tapan. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna.